Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Your Excellency, President Pedro Pires, former President of Cape Verde, and President of Pedro Pires Institute of Leadership. Bonjour, chers collègues. My presentation is going to be in English, and I've been given 15 minutes to set the stage. So what I'll do with the 15 minutes is really to give you some very relevant statistics that should guide the conversation. And then I'll put on the table ideas of what we should be looking at in addressing this interesting issue relating to young people, migration, and employment. Now, in terms of statistics, many African economies are gaining momentum with annual economic growth on the continent projected to accelerate to 3.9% in 2019 and in 2020. Ordinarily, this would be good news, but it's not really very good news because this projected acceleration is not enough to create the quality of jobs that we require for those who are entering into the labor force. And before I continue, let me also express my appreciation to APF for inviting us to be part of this important discussion. This is my first time of engaging with this work, with the organization, but we see this work as very, very crucial, and we commit to working with APF, not just to have this conversation, but to see how we turn the conclusions of this meeting into concrete action. Another point that we should take into consideration is that the growth model for many African economies still relies on traditional low productivity sectors, export of commodities, public expenditure, and the private investment tends to be in the low productivity areas. The second key thing to note in terms of statistics is that only 4.3% of Africa's working age population is unemployed. So unemployment rate is 4.3%. Ordinarily, there should be good news. However, this does not give the true picture. Because as you're aware, for many people in Africa, unemployment is not an option. So many of them take on jobs that are precarious, jobs that do not fully utilize their skills and expertise. So what we have in Africa is a high level of underemployment. Indeed, when you look at the situation in the continent, we find that the youth unemployment rate, despite the fact that unemployment covers, it doesn't give you the full picture, but the youth unemployment rate in Northern Africa is the highest at 30%. By the time you unpack this, what it means is that young women and men are 3.5 times more likely to be unemployed than adults. But remember I said the unemployment figures do not tell the full story. When you look at this in terms of gender, based on the figures available for 2017 and 2018, the unemployment rate for women is more than twice that of men, particularly in North Africa. And the figures that we've shown in terms of unemployment, it covers certain heterogeneity in the continent, where you have figures of 1.8 for Ethiopia, 6% for Nigeria, and 27.3% for South Africa. But like I said earlier, the unemployment figures don't tell the full story. Many workers, particularly young workers, find themselves having to take up unattractive jobs that tend to be in the informal economy. And these jobs are characterized by low pay, little or no access to social protection, no respect for their rights. And if we look at the share of the informal employment in Africa, we find that 90% of total employment in Africa is in the informal economy. And this is based on this report that was released in 2017 on global informal economy work, and this was released by the ILO. When we look at the statistics for young people, 94.9% being the aggregate level of informal work by African youth. In West Africa, the figure is 97.8%. So that's something we should put at the back of our minds as we look at the issue of employment, migration, and the youth of Africa. Related to the issues I raised earlier is working poverty, where people are working, but they remain either moderately or in extreme poverty. In Africa, this is very widespread. 250 million workers in Africa were living in extreme or moderate poverty in 2018. Although gender inequality in the labor market is also a regional phenomenon, it's worth noting that the gender gaps are widest in Northern Africa. Another key issue to bear in mind is agriculture, which still accounts for 55% of total employment in 2018. So the total number of jobs that were created in 2018, more than half of them were in agriculture. In absolute terms, between 2000 and 2018, agriculture accounted for half of all the jobs created. But it's also important to note that a lot of these jobs were in subsistence agriculture, they were in the informal economy, and they were low productivity, low wage jobs. And the reason that agriculture continues to account for a high proportion of the jobs created in the continent is because 60% of the population, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, lives in the rural area. Faced with all this, a lot of our young people are looking to migrate as a solution. The formal economy is tiny. Some will say minuscule. The informal economy is huge. The opportunities to optimize the potentials of young women and men is limited. So many of them see travel across the borders as a way of being able to access decent work, good quality work, and through that, a good quality life. We should not stop migration. We can't, even if we wanted to. But what we should do is to make migration a choice and not a necessity. Migration should not be seen by young women and men as the only route to decent work and a decent quality of life. Now let's look at some of the statistics on migration. Based on the report that was prepared by the African Union in collaboration with the ILO, it is clear that about 80% of migrants who leave their countries in Africa stay in Africa. So the notion in the popular media that Africans are running out of Africa to go to Europe, to America, is not consistent with the statistics that we have. In fact, when we now analyze the data by sub-region, most Africans who leave their countries stay within their sub-region. And the highest rate of those who stay within their sub-region is found in West Africa. Another point we should note in terms of migration: the migrant from Africa has the face of a young woman or a young man. The median age of the migrant from Africa is 37. Increasingly, young women are migrating in their own right rather than accompanying their male family members. The 2018 Global Estimates on International Migrant Workers that was released by the ILO shows that 65% of all international migrants are migrant workers. So migration today is linked directly or indirectly to the search for a job and better wages. And migrant workers in Africa today represent 8% of the total population of migrants worldwide. And the figures we have is 13 million. Now, having given you very quickly some of the figures, what should we do? What are we doing as ILO in partnership with other development partners? I'll highlight 4. The first, and this is why I started with the statistics. In line with the recommendations of the report of the Global Commission on the Future of Work, which was co-chaired by President Ramaphosa and the Prime Minister of Sweden, it is crucial for national governments and those who support them to begin to significantly invest in youth capabilities, both to respond to the current labor market needs, but also to begin to anticipate the future needs of the labor market. Lifelong learning, in having investments funded from both public, private, and other partners, is key to ensuring that we have the necessary skills for the different transitions that young people will go through during their working lives. Work to school transitions, but beyond that, transitions through different career epochs. The second thing we're putting on the table, with 60 to 80% of Africans working in rural areas, and about 90% of them in the informal economy, any intervention to promote decent work in Africa and keep Africans productively engaged in the sustainable development of the continent, any intervention that does not address the needs of the informal economy is just being superficial. And it's not to keep the informal economy informal, but how do we ensure that we create decent jobs and we help the informal economy to transit and become formal? This is a key area of work, and related to that is the need to unlock the potentials of the rural economy. As indicated earlier, a lot of jobs, half of the jobs, in fact, more than half of the jobs, specifically in 2018, was created in the rural economy. How do we unlock the potentials of the rural economy and move them from what we refer to as current bedrocks of misery to the space where African wealth is created, where young people are able to optimize the opportunities and translate or transform these rural economies into areas where wealth and decent work is created. Third, African young men and women are resilient. We've seen that. They take risks, sometimes involving them being killed in the Mediterranean. They're great risk takers. They're resilient. They're innovative. They're also now connected to the digital space. When we look within the context of the current realities, but more within the context of the future of work and the implications of technology, there is an imperative to invest in young women and men optimizing the opportunities currently available in the digital economy of Africa. In this regard, it's important to move from the one-sided, very superficial interventions that we've seen, which is just to provide them with digital skills. There's a need to look at the entire ecosystem, the demand, the supply, the intermediation. How do we create the environment that will enable African young women and men contribute to developing the digital economy of the continent, but more importantly, benefit from this economy? Here, there should be emphasis on facilitating job-ready digital skills, developing policies that promote employment-conducive structural transformation, and it is clear that as the digital economy in Africa grows, there will be demand for the skills, there will be higher quality employment, and this will have also implications for earnings. But for this to happen, there has to be an effective management of that digital space. The fourth, and I'll stop here, we need to implement the continental strategy that has been adopted by heads of states. One of the problems, and President Kagame brilliantly summed it up last year, one of the problems we have, both within the continent and also with those who say they want to support the continent, is the attempt to assume that nothing was done before and start from scratch. One of the most important strategies that African heads of states adopted was in January 2015. And this is a strategy for the effective, comprehensive governance of labor migration so that migration within Africa will not only contribute to sustainable development, it will contribute to regional integration. This is a comprehensive program, long-term transformational program, and it addresses all the 8 interlocking paths that will enable the continent fully utilize its young women and men across countries for regional integration and sustainable development. This program is called the Joint Labor Migration Program, spearheaded by the AU, with support from the ILO, from IOM, from ECA. And it addresses issues of skills, issues of labor, of statistics, issues of social, standards, issues of policies, issues of capacities, issues of interministerial coordination, issues around the portability of benefits across borders, but more importantly, it addresses the myths that fund xenophobia, the myths that will not allow the continent maximize the demonstrated benefits of migration. And I'll just end with a study that was conducted by the ILO and OECD, looking at the benefits of migration in developing countries across the world. But 3 countries in Africa were studied: South Africa, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire. Specifically in South Africa, we have documented evidence from that ILO OECD study that, in fact, rather than taking jobs, migrant workers contribute to job creation. Migrant workers contribute to GDP. Migrant workers in these countries contribute to innovation. And so one of the key parts of the Joint Labor Migration Program, and I must give a lot of kudos to Madam Zuma, who was the key champion when this program was developed, is that it really debunks a lot of those myths. One of the other myths that it debunks, and I'll stop here, is that migration is a unidirectional flow from Africa out. Not true. In 2015, close to 1 million migrants from Europe came into Africa. Close to 1 million migrants, more than 1 million migrants from Asia came to Africa. So part of that comprehensive program, which looks at all the areas I mentioned earlier, is statistics. So that policy making is anchored on facts, and then we can use those same facts as young people to demand for answers, to challenge policymakers, to monitor those policies that have been adopted, developed at national or continental levels. Thank you very much for your attention.